let's just take a look at the highlights of the High Middle Ages that we just finished. So in terms of issues and challenges, this was the height of papal power over temporal rulers that they reached during this time. The Crusades, you mentioned, there was a lot of anti-Semitism and the schism with Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which someone mentioned. We have the waves and waves of renewal and revival in the monasteries and the papacy. We still see a lot of monasticism, both cloistered in the monasteries and non-cloistered out in the world, both men and women. So you all touched, or some of you touched on that. There was a huge emphasis on the sacraments, pilgrimage, and intense lay piety. They weren't all of that educated in terms of, the scriptures and theology, but they loved Jesus in the best way that they knew. And then in terms of the social cultural things that were going on, we saw the rise of universities and an intellectual revival. We saw the medieval synthesis of faith and reason being used together. We saw the construction of Gothic cathedrals and ministry in new growing cities. There was a lot of urbanization and men and women ministering in cities. And I didn't mention this, but by this point in time, there across Western Europe, there really is a common ethical framework. Not everything was perfect by any means, but there really was kind of different from later periods, as a common ethical framework. So we're going to move tonight into the late Middle Ages, and this is just a 200-year period from 1300 to 1500. And this is often called the autumn of Christendom. And it's easy to understand this period as like a precursor to the Reformation, which is coming in the 1500s. So we're going to do the late Middle Ages in two weeks, 2 classes. And tonight we're going to talk about the changing world. They're going to talk a lot of socioeconomic, socio-political stuff and dissent and just a tremendous amount of change that's going on. And then next week we'll come down from the big picture and we'll look at lay people only. We're not going to look at any monks or popes next week, just some lay people and a lot of case studies about the type of spirituality that was going on in the late Middle Ages, which was probably even more intense than the High Middle Ages. This is the timeline. And again, that summary matrix, the timeline, and the outline are all in the OneDrive folder that I sent you the link to, which I'll keep sending you the link to as we go through these 2 classes. All right. So as we move into this period, we see a number of changes that are going to begin to alter the pattern of life that we've been studying in the period 1000 to 1300. We're going to see new political conditions, new economic conditions, and they start to affect the context that the church is going to be operating in. We're going to see a shift in the image of the scales that I've shown you a couple of times, where the altar is on one side of the scale and the temporal rule is on the other. And in the High Middle Ages, the greater by far weight was on the church. We're going to see that shift in this period where the temporal rulers become more powerful and the church is becoming, relatively speaking, less powerful. One of the powerful factors that's going to be in play in this late Middle Ages is population decrease. In the High Middle Ages, we saw population increase. So in the High Middle Ages, there was sort of like a mini global warming. Just the temperatures for a long period of time in the High Middle Ages were warmer. And they had good crops. They put more land under cultivation, so there was more food, better nutrition, so people were healthier, they lived longer, children lived longer, so we saw population increase. But in the late Middle Ages, we're going to see the exact opposite. And during the course of the 1300s, the 14th century, in just a single 5-year period, the population of Europe fell by 25 million. And that was 1/3 of the population gone in 5 years. And just take 1 second to imagine 1/3 of the population of the United States wiped out in 5 years. It was unbelievable. And we have a hard time getting our minds around the Black Death, the Black Plague. It was and has been the most devastating. It's just been unmatched in the history of epidemics. One Italian writer of the time said that victims of the plague had lunch with their friends and dinners with their ancestors in paradise. And literally, you could contract the disease and be dead within a day or two, 4 days tops. Fathers abandoned their sons. Lawyers wouldn't come and write out wills for the dying. Friars and nuns, they were left to care for the sick, and they did. And monasteries and convents were soon deserted because the monks and nuns taking care of the sick contracted it, and they died as well. There was no one to give people a proper Christian burial. Bodies were simply dumped into big holes and then covered with a little dirt, and then more bodies dumped in, and just in layers. And there's this terrible, uncontrolled killer loose across Europe, and medieval medicine had nothing to combat it with. This is an image of a doctor in the Black Death, and they wore these masks with a long beak that they somehow thought would protect them from. They thought that the plague came through vapors, so they wore these masks to try to protect themselves. But can you imagine that this doctor looking like this coming to your house? There's a psychological impact here as well. So entire villages, monasteries, communities were wiped out. And in just a few days, a whole community could be wiped out. And it left large swaths of land empty. So this population decrease is going to change the shape of late medieval society and politics. But also there's this huge psychological impact. You know, not just social, not just political, but psychological as well. People of that time wrote that this must be the judgment of God, because this disease seemed to come from nowhere and strike with this supernatural force that was beyond human resource or prevention. It felt like the hand of God to them. And in writings of the time, contemporary writings of the time, we find a lot of existential questioning about life, and is this the end of the world? And most of all, we just see so much fear. And in the art of the time, and art following this for a while, we see a lot of reminders of human mortality. So for example, this is the tomb of a woman named Alice Chaucer. And this is in England. And she was the grandmother of the famous poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote Canterbury Tales. And Alice was widowed 3 times. She had 3 husbands die, and they were all wealthy. So she ended up being a wealthy woman in her own right. And there's this beautiful, really amazing marble sculpture on the top of her tomb of Alice. Her body looks regal. But then if the tomb is set up like a bunk bed, and there's this layer and there's a layer underneath. And so if you look down on the bottom bunk, there's this sculpture of Alice's cadaver. Really quite shocking. And it was important for medieval society to see this idealized death and think about the transformed body as it would be in the new heaven and the new earth, but also for them to look and see the reminder of their mortality, to see the bones. And that's classic in this period. We see a lot of what's called cadaver art. And these are just some pictures of other cadaver sculptures that were on tombs. And in other forms of art, besides sculpture, there was a lot of, like I said, reminders to people of their mortality. All right. Also in this society that's dominated by fear, we see relics being deployed. Remember relics, they're like parts of saints or objects associated with saints. And in the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, remember with Charlemagne, he had relics in his throne and relics in his crown, and they collected relics and they deployed them to help them in battle. But now they're being deployed to deliver people from the plague. They were, a sort of to us a very superstitious approach, but they were using relics in this way. And why have these prayers not been answered? It's a lot of questioning, and in this culture of the society of fear and questioning what's going on, we see the burning of Jewish communities, and the Jews are being blamed as somehow responsible for God's judgment in the Black Death. We also see increased witch hunts. Somebody needs to be blamed. This is how they feel. They're afraid. It's a judgment of God. Somebody needs to be blamed. Somebody needs to be punished so that this, God will stop this. All right, so we see this with scapegoating, so to speak. On the socioeconomic level, with all this death, so many people died that there were labor shortages, just sort of practical things here that are happening from all this death. So laborers can demand more money for their labor now because there aren't enough laborers. And what we see in the 1300s are huge challenges from the lower ranks of society against the prevailing social structures. And this is a picture of a peasants' revolt in England in 1381. And it was a pretty dramatic revolt, and the peasants were led by an English peasant and also a radical English priest. And it wasn't so much really a battle, but it was more like a prolonged, like a protest against taxation and also a demand for higher wages, kind of like a medieval form of collective action. This is the first example of popular rebellion in England. They weren't particularly successful, although they did prevent the addition of any further poll taxes. But this is happening not just in England, but all over Europe right now. Another thing that was going on that was impactful to the socioeconomics was a severe run of bad harvests. We had such great harvests during the High Middle Ages, but now we've got a run of bad harvests, which means that we're going to have rising prices for agricultural goods. And also there's this huge increase amount of land available. And so if there's more land than there is demand for it, obviously economics will say that the value of land is going to plummet, and that's what happened as well. And so nobility claimed their superiority or their place in society based on the land that they own. But now this land is worth so much less, so they couldn't claim that so easily anymore. And the feudal structure started to break down. And serfs and peasants, they were no longer so tightly held to the land of these nobles. So there was even more urbanization than there was in the High Middle Ages. More and more people going into the cities. Large-scale urbanization. And here these social groups are finding freedom from serfdom. They're finding freedom to make more money, make it more easily, get some sort of political autonomy for themselves. And there's a famous phrase from this period, the air of the city is free. We might not think think this along those same lines, but this was a really important aspect of these late Middle Ages transitioning into the Reformation. The air of the city is free. So we see the continued and even much faster and larger growth of this commercial merchant middle class. They develop new cultural lifestyles, new perspectives of life. They have far, far less investment in maintaining the traditions of society. They're open for change. They're really entrepreneurial and innovative in everything, in the deepest sense of the word. Even in their religious lives, they start to get experimental, and we're going to see some of that next week. And it's among these groups that the Protestant teaching spreads most rapidly when we get to the Protestant Reformation. And we also see groups of people growing who are educated, but they're not part of the clergy. Whereas before, most of the educated people of society were in the clergy. Now we see other people getting as highly educated, but they're not part of the clergy. So we see the breakdown in these urban areas of the monopoly of the church in the realm of ideas and thinking and intellect. And universities, which are there, they're beginning to produce trained intellectuals who are using their minds and their skills in the service of their employers instead of in the service of the church. Huge changes. And society is becoming more complex. And with the complex society, you need more bureaucracy, usually. And so we see this expanded literacy and education, creating people that can become upwardly mobile as in positions in the bureaucracies of state. And they're going there, the bureaucracies of state, for their advancement in their careers. Not always the church the way it used to be. So we see literacy also beginning to spread widely among women, also wealth among women. We saw Alice Chaucer. And women are among the first to receive the writings of Martin Luther when he started the Protestant Reformation. Women became an important force for the Reformation during the 1500s. Well, so we have this growing group of literate and educated people, and they start to become capable of formulating criticisms of the failings of the church. So people weren't necessarily opposed to the church or even to the papacy, but they began to start to critique the financial dealings and the political machinations of the church and the papacy. And as we're going to see, that was something really, well, let's just get into that. So the church had been a primary landowner in the feudal system. So you had the nobles with their land, and you had the church with their land. And so just like with the nobles, if we see land values plummeting, that's going to have an effect on the pocketbook of the church as well. And it hurt them as much as it did the nobles in terms of decreased wealth. And they started to have financial problems. And one of the ways that they addressed that was increasing the church tax on people, not popular with people. And we also, because of all the number of clergy dying, because of caring for the sick during the Black Death, manpower in the church was diminished greatly as well. So we've got problems in the church that aren't necessarily all of their own fault, but they're a result of the Black Death. But also there are some things that are their fault. Things that are going on internal to the church leadership that are really altering the church for the worst in the late Middle Ages. And in 1309, Clement V, who was the Pope, moved the papacy, the office of the papacy, himself and all of his administration. He moved them from Rome to Avignon, France. And this is in southern France. It's beautiful wine growing country. But he moved there and he built this. This was the residence and for the Pope and all of the administration. And he surrounded himself with a set of French cardinals, and all the popes from 1309 to 1376 were French. And all of the devout Christians in Europe are troubled by this. It's like the Pope has abandoned the seat of Peter in Rome. And this is a picture from the time of Rome, and this Black woman here is representing Rome mourning for the loss of the Pope. There was a poet at the time in Italy by the name of Petrarch who called this time period the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. I love that expression. Eventually in 1337, so about almost 30 years after Clement V moved it to Avignon, one of the female mystics of the 14th century by the name of Catherine of Siena got involved, and she actually wrote so many letters and impassioned pleas that the Pope in 1337 went back to Rome. We're going to talk about Catherine of Siena next week. She was not a nun or religious. She was one of those lay people. But anyways, the Pope at the time, Gregory the 11th, returned back to Rome. And he set about to repair things and, fix things and make things better. And he was sincere about it, but he died right after he got back. So the cardinals elected the next Pope, and he was Italian, and he was committed to reform, let this be a lesson to us. He was committed to reform. He had the right things in his mind, but he was rude and ill-tempered. And so much so that the cardinals were like, we made a mistake. We just elected him under stress, and it wasn't right, and we didn't mean it. So they set about to vote in a new Pope. And that Pope goes right back to France, right back to Avignon. Unfortunately, the rude Pope doesn't back down. So now you have two popes who excommunicate each other, and they create rival bureaucracies and cardinals, and they both raise church taxes on the people. So from 1378, when that new Pope went back, to 1417, we have a long line of two lines of popes, both demanding allegiance from Europe, and Europe is like bewildered. There was even a church council in 1409 that tried to solve the problem by saying, neither of you are the Pope, and we're going to elect a third one, but neither of those two backed down. So now for a time, you have three popes in Europe. And this really led to a diminishing of respect for the papacy during this time. It's hard to see the goodness of God in a very corrupt church. And this was one of the factors that leads to the decrease in power and influence of the altar on that scale. Another factor happening at the same time as this was going on was the growth of national governments. So that growing middle class that we talked about, they really supported having a centralized government, a centralized strong monarch, king, who could keep the power of the nobles under control. That helped them, that helped the merchants. And out of this growth of these strong centralized monarchies, several modern states emerged, particularly France, England, and the Scandinavian countries were the first to have their countries united under a relatively strong monarchy. This is something new. And we see the growth of nationalism. And nationalism is where, instead of identifying with your your family or your kin group or your city. Now, all of a sudden, you begin to understand something called the nation of France or the nation of England. And you have this sense of community with others in your nation over and against the rest of Europe. And this nationalism, in turn, undermined the papal claims for universal authority because different nations began to be loyal or allegiant to different popes. The Pope in France, remember there's two of them, the Pope in France, the Pope in Rome. So for instance, if the Pope leaned towards France and, favoring France, then England would just be ready to disobey and oppose them because England and France hated each other. So depending on which part of Europe you were in, that's the Pope that you would support or not support. And this period where you've got the two lines of popes, we have another schism, and this one's called the Great Western Schism. So it's all in the Western part of the church, but it's called the Great Western Schism because of the two lines of popes. So all of Europe is divided in its allegiance to different popes. And again, the net result is that the papacy loses a great deal of its prestige and authority. And many began hoping for a reformation of the church that would come from some other source than the Pope. But let's go back to those nations for a little while, because this is important too. They start to become the focus of people's loyalties. And war had a major part to play in that. War tends to pull people together against the enemy. And we see that in France and England during the late Middle Ages. During this period, there was something called the 100 Years' War. It was the dominant political and military event of the 14th and 15th centuries, and it's very, very, very complex, and I'm not going to get into it, but off and on for 100 years, France and England were at war with each other. So as people look to their national monarchies as their identity, the nations becoming their identity, these national monarchies at the same time start taking a proactive role in the governance of the churches in their nation, in their area. And so we see this idea that the popes had of this universal church across all national units or tribes or anything, this one universal church that is falling apart at this point because we have the nations, and the nations are actually controlling the churches in their areas, independent areas. All right, so Christendom is getting weary. They're getting weary of all this stuff that's going on. But there are going to be some movements of dissent starting. And these movements are going to seek to reform not only the life of the church, but also even some of the doctrines or the teachings of the church. And the two most outstanding leaders of this type of dissent were John Wycliffe in England and John Huss of Bohemia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. So first of all, John Wycliffe, and I don't know if that name rings a bell. Wycliffe rings a bell with you, but maybe some of you have heard of Wycliffe Bible translators. And I'll show you, or you'll hear later on as we go through his story about why a Bible translation society would be named after Wycliffe. But he was born in England in 1330. And as a teenager, he left for Oxford in England, Oxford University. And in those times, there was a lot of disruption to education and university life because of the Black Death epidemic. And that kind of resonates also with our current situation. But despite the disruption, after 16 years of incessant preparation at the university, he finally earned his doctorate. He was 42, and he was recognized as the leading theologian and philosopher of that time at Oxford. And as a scholar, so he's a scholar, he's not a monastic, but he starts to attack what he considered the abuses in the church. And the Pope wrote 5 scathing bulls against Wycliffe. And bull or papal bull was just a type of public decree. So he'd write this, I decree that, and he wrote 5 of them against Wycliffe and what Wycliffe was teaching. Wycliffe was declared in error about his criticisms of the church authority and the church organization. But Wycliffe wrote that men had authority straight from God, and that if they were in mortal sin, their authority was in appearance only. And he said that the church was in sin and it ought to give up its possessions and go back to apostolic poverty. He was not popular with the church hierarchy. Another thing that he did was he taught some followers his teachings, and he sent them out to preach to the people in their own language, so in English as opposed to Latin. And in those days, you had to be authorized to preach, and these men that he sent out were not authorized by the church hierarchy. So he sent them out to preach. But he didn't stop there. So he's been called the morning star of the Reformation because of the following teachings, and they're going to sound pretty familiar to most of you. He said that the head of the church is Christ alone. And he emphasized the individual's person's direct relationship to God through Christ. He believed that the bread and the wine of the Eucharist were unchanged after consecration, and that the presence and receiving of Christ was just based on the faith of the individual participant. And he started to really come under heavy attack now, even at Oxford. So not just the papacy, but also at his university where he's teaching. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the head of the church in England, called a council with Wycliffe and church leadership to discuss what was going on with Wycliffe. And it's called the Earthquake Council because of an unusual earthquake that occurred at the time of this meeting, this council. And both sides interpreted the earthquake as a visible sign of God's judgment on the other one. Eventually, his works got banned, and he was not working at Oxford, so he had less and less to do, and he had more time for another contribution to us, and that was his translation of the Bible into vernacular English, which means the English of the ordinary people. So in this twilight of his career, he came to a fully developed position on the authority of Scripture. And here again, he said that it was the right of every Christian to know the Bible. The Bible emphasizes the need for Christians to see the importance of Christ alone as the sufficient way of salvation, without the aid of pilgrimages and works and mass and all that. And these are a couple of things that he wrote. And this is back in the 1300s. This is a couple of years before Martin Luther, but these sound so familiar to us. Holy Scripture is the preeminent authority for every Christian. For as much as the Bible contains Christ, that is all that is necessary for salvation. It is necessary for all men, not for priests alone. It's talking about the Bible. It's the supreme law. And then he says, obtain a reliable text, understand the logic of Scripture, compare the parts of Scripture with one another, maintain an attitude of humble seeking, and receive the instruction of the Spirit. That sounds kind of like the way I study the Bible now, all these 700 years later. So these are some of the quotes from his writing on why he translated the Bible into English, so everybody in England where he lived could read it, study it. He died in 1384 of a natural death by a stroke. And when he did die, so after he translated the Bible, he became extremely condemned. I mean, so much wrath against him. But when he died, he hadn't been declared a heretic. He died Orthodox is what they would call it. But after his death, in 1415, a council declared him a heretic after he was already dead. And they ordered his writings to be burned, and they had his bones dug up out of a Christian cemetery, and they burned his bones and scattered them in a river. Because if you're a heretic, you can't be in a Christian cemetery. But his ashes were easier to dispose of than his teachings and his English translation. And one of the places where his writings were carried was Bohemia, the Czech Republic now. And they were taken up by a man there named John Huss and his followers. So here's John Huss. He was born in Bohemia in 1372, 12 years before Wycliffe died. And in 1391 in Prague, which is the main city there, a couple of men founded something called the Bethlehem Temple. And this is a place where the Bible could be taught solely in the Czech vernacular. So in other words, the language of the common people there. And when he was 30, John Huss became the preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel. And this picture on the right is a modern picture of it. It's still there today. So, so he's preaching in this chapel, unauthorized. He's preaching in the common language, not in Latin. And he held to many of Wycliffe's teachings about the church and about the scriptures and everything. The one place where he didn't agree with Wycliffe was that he believed that the Eucharist was changed into the body and blood. But what he fought for was for lay people to be able to partake of it more easily. Anyways, so he's teaching Wycliffe stuff over here in Prague, and he's teaching in English. And the church in Prague condemned Wycliffism, they called it, all the teachings of Wycliffe. And the Pope issued a bull, papal bull or decree in 1410 that prohibited preaching in private chapels. So Huss himself in 1410 and 1411 was excommunicated by the church. And in 1412, his followers, the followers of Huss and other followers of Wycliffism, have public demonstrations in the streets of Prague. And the Pope threatens an interdict. Now, what that means is if the Pope puts a city under interdict, any of the sacraments that take place while it's under interdict are not valid. So in other words, if a baby is baptized when the city is under interdict, that baptism isn't valid. And so according to what we've talked about what they believe about the sacraments, that baby is still in his original sin. So this is in their worldview, this is a big thing. So Huss, to stop that from happening, he leaves and he voluntarily goes into exile. Well, a couple of years later, Huss is called to a council, another church council, and he's promised safety. He goes there, he goes to the Council of Constance in Germany. But when he gets there, they throw him in prison. And in 1415, he's tried and he's burned as a heretic. And I just want to say a few words about the death penalty for heretics, because it just sounds, I mean, to us, it's like unbelievable, just astonishing that this could happen. I just want to say a few words, not that I condone it, but just to try to get into their mindset. So Thomas Aquinas, we talked about him last week, the theologian that combined faith and reason. So he wrote a lot about this, but he advocated the death penalty for obstinate or stubborn heretics. And one of the things he wrote is, so he compared a heretic, somebody who is in their mind teaching false faith, he compared him to somebody who forged money. So he said, it is a much graver matter to corrupt the faith, which quickens the soul, than to forge money, which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to be not only excommunicated, but even put to death. So they had this worldview, this mindset of that a heretic was putting people's eternal souls at risk by their false teaching. Aquinas said, that it's only if you're obstinate. They were given 2-3 chances to change their mind, but then they needed to be delivered to the secular tribunal, and the death penalty applied. And again, this isn't because they were evil. What they did, I mean, it's evil, burning people to death or hanging them or whatever else. But they sincerely believed that teaching against the orthodox beliefs of the church was endangering the eternal souls of people. And this attitude of Aquinas, it wasn't new then. It was something that's been around for much longer than Aquinas, much before Aquinas, but it was the prevalent attitude of his time. And again, I'm not trying to say anything good about it, but just to help you try to understand where it was coming from. It's just another picture of that being burned. So from 1417 to 1436, so for 19 years, Huss's followers fought wars with the Catholic forces of the Holy Roman Empire. And this was an example of the crusading ideal being used turned inwardly. So the Pope called these wars for these 19 years, he called them anti-Hussite crusades. And it's a really long, complicated story, but they finally got to a peace compromise. But it was very much more favorable to the Catholic teaching than to the more radical Hussites. So they kind of went underground, but they would be heard from again. There's so much more we could say about John Huss. He's got a nickname, the incendiary preacher of Prague. He only wrote one book called De Ecclesia, which is translated the church. And in it, he encouraged Christians to trust God, but question the church. And I just want to give you this one quote to understand where John Huss was coming from. It sounds so modern and resonant to us. He said, for both the Pope and his curia, his administration, make mistakes from ignorance of the truth. Of one kind is the faith which is placed in God. He cannot deceive or be deceived. Of another is the faith placed in the Pope, who may deceive or be deceived. Of one kind is the faith placed in Holy Scripture. Another, faith in a bull, a decree thought out in a human way. Huss's motto was truth conquers, and that motto is actually was used as a rallying cry in political movements in the early 20th century and in the first Czech Republic. They actually put John Huss's motto "Truth conquers" in their flag and emblem back then in the 20s. One more thing about John Huss. So he had all this reforming zeal, truly he did, but he was always a pastor. And when he was imprisoned before his execution for that year, he wrote a number of letters to his congregation. And some scholars consider these letters that he wrote among the world's treasures. I haven't ever read any of them, but after reading about them, I want to read some of them. Supposedly they remind us of Paul's prison letters, and they truly reflect his pastoral heart. In 1919, the Pope at the time, John Paul II, issued an apology on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. He said, "Today, on the eve of the Great Jubilee, I feel the need to express deep regret for the cruel death inflicted on John Huss and for the subsequent wound of conflict and division, which was thus imposed on the minds and hearts of the Bohemian people." So one other thing that happened or started during the 1400s was the Renaissance. And this was a period it kind of marked the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity. It sort of seems like an extension of the Middle Ages, but it's going to have or be associated with huge social change. And it was a time when scholars and artists and everybody wanted to revive the glories of classical antiquity. So they wanted to go back to the glories of ancient Greece and Rome. Renaissance means rebirth, and it sprang up first in Italy, and then it spread to the rest of Western Europe. And they had a prejudice against anything that was of that time. They wanted to go all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome and their ancient civilization. And there was a focus on a big focus on humanism, but what they meant by humanism was they defined it as a study of the humanities, or the study of the liberal arts, the sources of classical literature. And when Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Church, when all of that fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, tons of people fled and were exiled, and they went to Italy, and they brought with them their knowledge of the classical Greek literature, because Greek had always remained the language, but in the eastern half. So they knew this classical Greek literature. Martin Luther, the reformer, was born when the Renaissance had started, and he grew up in this atmosphere. And I think it's interesting. I read something that I just want to share with you that he wrote in a letter. So this is Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer. He said, "I am persuaded that without knowledge of literature, pure theology cannot at all endure. Just as there heretofore, when letters or literature, studies of the humanities he's talking about, when that's declined and lain prostrate, theology too has wretchedly fallen and lain prostrate. Nay, I see that there has never been a great revelation of the word of God unless he has first prepared the way by the rise and prosperity of languages and letters, as though they were John the Baptist of a great revelation." So he believed in the study of the liberal arts, which I thought was very interesting. In terms of the art of the time, up till the Renaissance, all of art pretty much had been devoted exclusively to religious instructions or the glory of God. But now the artists are starting to turn their attention to human splendor. And this on the left here is Michelangelo from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And you see Adam here on the left in this picture. And Adam is this muscular, glorious specimen of a human being, because they're really focused on that now. And on the right here is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci wanted to be the universal man. And he had this vision of humanity. And this is kind of like what is developing in the mindset of a lot of people during the Renaissance, that a vision of humanity is having unlimited capabilities, both for good and for evil. I'm going to come back to chat if we have a chance, but I just want to finish up one more thing. So during the Renaissance, we have to come back to the popes here one more time. So the popes during the time of the Renaissance were very interested in art, and the popes of this period came from, for the most part, from wealthy Italian families. It's mostly the House of Borgia and the House of Medici, which you might have watched. Some of you might have watched that. I think it's Netflix series Medici. But these are where the popes were coming from, these wealthy Italian families. And they loved the Renaissance art and architecture. So one of the popes actually commissioned the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He commissioned Michelangelo to do that. And on the right here, another artist, Raphael, was commissioned to do the tapestries along the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Leo X was a pope from the Medici family. And his big project was rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica in Rome because it had been kind of neglected when the popes were in France, and he wanted to renovate it. And remember, so that the church at this time, as I've already mentioned, they'd had some financial challenges. They weren't as wealthy as they had always been, but he had this big idea, this big project. And so one of the ways that the church had used to raise money was the selling of indulgences. And an indulgence was basically just a slip of paper that you bought that said a certain amount of time was taken off of your time in purgatory. And that doctrine of purgatory had just become an official teaching just prior to the late Middle Ages. And with the Black Death and the intense fear it created, purgatory really became something really big in people's minds. And people really wanted to buy indulgences, so they sold easily. Well, Leo X here, this Pope, really went all out selling, in a big campaign to sell indulgences. And Pope Leo is the Pope when Martin Luther starts to protest. We're starting to see the connection here to the Reformation age. So the first thing that Martin Luther protests against isn't everything that developed into the Protestantism. What he was first protesting was the selling of indulgences. Well, besides being patrons of the art, these Renaissance popes were just Italian princes. They were not spiritual leaders. And some of them were quite vicious characters caught up in political or sexual intrigues. And the papacy really hadn't been in this bad a shape since the end of the Dark Ages, when the popes were just the puppets of the nobility back then. They haven't been in this bad a shape for 1,000 years, but it's a new kind of bad shape. And we're not going to talk about the popes anymore until we get a little bit with the class or the Reformation. So because next week I want to, like I said, go back to the ground level to talk kind of a lot of political and economic and social kind of stuff here, but I want to look at this devotional life that developed among the lay people. And they were pretty intense in the High Middle Ages, but now the involvement of the laity in a devotional life is going to be happening at an extent that had never happened before. And we're going to see even that the way that they express their devotion is going to start to be new. And one last thing happening at the end of the late Middle Ages. Columbus. Spain, which had belonged to the Muslims for a long time, that Spain took it back for Christendom. Spain and Portugal started to get strong, and they started this process of exploration and expansion that is going to have huge consequences, huge impact on the history of the church. We'll start to see that in part 2. And one of the things was this rapid expansion of Catholicism in the New World. Spain went to where Spain went, they went to the New World, and the Portuguese went to Africa and Asia and Brazil. And in 1493, as this exploration is starting and the Spanish are going one way and the Portuguese are going another way, the Pope actually astonishingly drew some lines on a map of the world, and he divided up the world, and he said, this part is for the Spanish and this part is Portuguese. Just astonishing. Okay. Coming up next week, we're going to finish the late Middle Ages. The week after, April 6th, is your spring break. And then from April 13th to June 22nd, with May 25th off, we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation and the history of Christianity in the United States. I'm thinking a lot about how to do the history of Christianity in the United States, because well, it's so very close to us in time compared to all this that we've been doing, and also just sort of like right, right in the heart and soul here. So, um, like I've said before, I believe learning history is a form of activism, and I want that to be true for us. That learning our history of Christianity and in our country, uh, you know, I think Megan said it, that you learn this, whitewashed history, and I want us to learn some more deeper truths about our history, um, including Christianity, that will help us to not just to learn it, but to desire and be able to make changes and make this country that, for the most part, we like and we want to be here. We just want to make it better, and hopefully learning some more about our history will help make that possible for us.